Hello, Sol Soler here. I'm the philosopher and theoretical physicist who has written the Principles of the Physics of Consciousness. This lecture is called Fish and the Principles of the Physics of Consciousness. So this is how we apply the principles of the physics of consciousness to deducing the conscious states of other conscious entities apart from ourselves. And in particular, fish. In this, I chose fish as an example. How to apply some of the principles of the physics of consciousness. So this is the fourth in my latest series of lectures. The first lecture was a statement, explanation, and justification of the principles of the physics of consciousness. Then there were two lectures refuting common objections to the principles. And there's also a lecture on this channel where I give the correct interpretation of the experiments of quantum mechanics. So once you've listened to this lecture and see an application of the principles, you can go back if you haven't already and listen to the statement of the principles and can start studying the principles yourself. Okay, so let's begin. So I'm just going to read this essay and I'm going to comment on it as we work our way through it. So it begins, Hi, I'm the philosopher Sol Soler who has solved the scientific mystery of consciousness. Braggart, okay. So these essays, I wrote these essays, I'm taking these essays from online publications where I've published them online, and then I receive lots of questions and then I answer the questions in the form of essays. So now I'm reading out these essays and these form the text of the principles of the physics of consciousness. So yeah, there's might be 20 essays like this explaining different aspects of the principles of the physics of consciousness, and they'll be very short and they're very interesting as well. Okay. So, for this essay, someone asked me, what is the conscious life of my pet fish like? And I responded, this question offers me the perfect opportunity to explain the basic principles of the physics of consciousness, as well as demonstrate their remarkable explanatory power. Okay, first, we state the principles we will use to answer this question. Okay, so first, we give a clear statement of the principles that we'll use in the following essay. So, number one, the postulate of fundamental consciousness, or we could say the postulate of intrinsic consciousness. So, all the energy created in the Big Bang, and therefore all the particles that subsequently formed out of this energy, are conscious, are the physical manifestation of physical consciousness. These conscious particles can physically bond into new conscious forms. You yourself are one such conscious formation, and so is your fish. Okay, so this is the most fundamental postulate and principle within my physics of consciousness, and that is that all energy, all the physical energy of our universe is intrinsically conscious. So you are formed out of nothing but this energy. You're made out of energy and particles, and you are intrinsically conscious, and my physics is based on the postulate that all energy, the reason you're intrinsically conscious is because all energy, and therefore all particles made out of this energy, are all intrinsically conscious. Until now, scientists have only been working with the only other logical possibility, which is that energy isn't intrinsically conscious, and then consciousness somehow switches on. Now, for 100 years, they haven't been able to explain how it switches on. And the reason is it doesn't. It's the wrong postulate, as I've been showing. And I'm not going to talk about it. You can hear my justification for that in my previous essays. So all energy is intrinsically conscious. All particles are intrinsically conscious. And then they can form into different physical objects. And within each physical object is its subjective conscious experience. And you can verify this for at least yourself. You were formed out of nothing but energy and particles, and you're intrinsically conscious. You're intrinsically conscious. So that's the first postulate that we use. Number two, the second principle we use is the law of privacy. This law states that the only way to directly observe any conscious experience is to be the very same physical form experiencing it. So the only conscious experience you can experience or directly observe is your own, because you are within your own body. You're not within, if you look at someone else, you're not within their physical form. So you can't see their conscious experience. You can only see the objective manifestation of their consciousness, the objective manifestation of all the conscious energy. You can't see the subjective experience that takes place within it. Okay, an equivalent statement of the law of privacy. Consciousness is a purely subjective experience. Okay, so that means it can't be objectively observed. We know this from neuroscience. We look in a patient's brain. We can't see their thoughts and feelings or any of their conscious experience. We can just see the objective manifestation of energy, such as neurons and particles. But the conscious experience is within those things, and it can't be seen from without. Okay, so you are already very familiar with living subject to this law. The only consciousness you have ever directly observed is your own. You can observe another person's brain at any scale, but you will only ever see grey matter or groups of neurons or particles, and never their subjective conscious experience. Okay, the third principle is the principle of similar forms, okay? So similar configurations of conscious energy give rise to similar conscious experience within themselves. Different formations of conscious energy give rise to different conscious states within themselves. Okay, so this is why humans are capable of understanding one another, because we are very similar configurations of conscious energy, and therefore experience very similar, though by no means identical, conscious experiences. This principle will be most helpful in understanding your fish. So yeah, all humans are similar configurations of conscious energy, conscious physical energy. And that means within these configurations, we experience similar conscious states, conscious experiences. So we all have a brain, and our brains are similar shapes, and they're split into similar regions. We all have a left and a right hemisphere, and we all have the different, assuming you have a healthy brain that hasn't been damaged, you have all the same regions in your brain that I have. The region for vision is at the back of your brain, called the occipital lobe, for example. Then I have two eyes, you have two eyes, I presume. And they're constructed in a similar way with similar rods and cones in the retina, similar optic nerves. So these similar configurations give rise to similar experiences. I have a stomach, you have a stomach, connected via your nervous system to your brain, gives rise to similar experiences of hunger and satiety and stuff. So that's how we can understand each other. It's essential that we are similar physical configurations of conscious energy. That's how two humans can understand each other. It's why a human and a dog can understand each other. But then we're somewhat different configurations, so we can understand each other less. But you can understand when your dog is hungry, and you can understand that your dog has visual conscious experience because it has two eyes, and auditory conscious experience because it has two ears. And scientists have examined these things, and they are very similar to our own and function in a similar way, giving rise to similar conscious experiences within ourselves. Okay, so those are the principles that we're going to be using, and now we can begin applying them. So, by the law of privacy, we know that the only way to know anything about your fish's conscious experience is through inference. That is, by comparison with our own experience of human consciousness. This follows because the only way you can know anything about consciousness, including whether it exists or not, is through your own conscious experience. So please take a moment to verify this. If it wasn't for your own conscious experience, you wouldn't know that consciousness exists. No one else's conscious experience apart from your own proves to you that consciousness exists. Your only experience of consciousness is your own. So any understanding you ever have of consciousness must make reference to your own consciousness. Okay? And consciousness is purely subjective. So the only way to know it is purely subjectively. You know what human consciousness is like because you experience it. You don't know, for example, what a jellyfish consciousness is like. It could be wildly different. It'll have some things in common. It has a stomach, so it'll probably feel hunger, things like that. But it's such a different configuration. You don't know what, at the moment at least, you can't understand in any great detail what jellyfish consciousness is like, because there's such different formations of conscious energy. Okay? But the point is, if we do ever understand jellyfish consciousness, which I think someday via the principles of the physics of consciousness we will have much more insight into jellyfish consciousness, for example, it will still have to be with reference to your own experience of consciousness, because that's the only way you know consciousness exists, is through your own experience. And it's the only consciousness you've ever experienced. Okay. So, we examine your fish looking for any similar physical formations of conscious energy. And of course, there are many. So there are many similarities between the physical configuration of a fish and the physical configuration of a human. Your fish has 2 eyes connected to a brain. Thus we can conclude that it has light-based binocular visual consciousness. We can learn more about its visual consciousness by studying in what ways its eyes are similar and different from our own. For example, we can examine its retinas to see what range of wavelengths of light they respond to, and then we can work out what colors it can see. Similarly, we can deduce what resolution it sees with. We could then even possibly make some colored lenses that you could wear that would give you an approximate experience of your fish's visual consciousness. Of course, his or her eyes are on either side of his or her head, so that would have to be taken into account as well. So we could work out what wavelengths of light your fish sees in by studying its retina, and we could work out what resolution it sees with, and make lenses that approximate that type of experience. Okay, next. Your fish has conscious sensation of hot and cold. We can prove this by putting her in a large tank, one side of which is very cold and the other very hot. Okay, so you imagine we get a long, spacious tank, and this would be a very, very easy experiment to conduct to prove what I'm saying. You get a long tank. You fill one end of, you have a heater at one end and you have a freezer at the other end. So at one end the water is extremely hot, at the other end it's extremely cold, and there's a gradient along the length of the tank. Your fish will find the spot in the tank where the water temperature is most consciously pleasing to her. So then the fish obviously wouldn't go where the water is exceedingly hot if the water is boiling. And you know exactly why the fish would avoid that end of the tank, because the fish would feel physical pain just like you would if you put your hand in exceedingly hot water. The fish would also avoid the exceedingly cold end of the tank because, just like you, it doesn't like the conscious sensation of being exceedingly cold. So your fish will find the spot in the tank where the water temperature is most consciously pleasing to her. You yourself would produce the same behavior in a large hall with an equivalent temperature gradient. So yeah, just like the fish, we could put a human in a hall. At one end of the hall, the air is very hot, extremely hot. At the other end of the hall, it's extremely cold. And you would naturally sit somewhere in the middle where the temperature was most pleasing to you. Okay. Also, your fish has a stomach connected to its brain, and we can design experiments that involve her being deprived of food and then having to make some physical effort to acquire food, from which we can conclude that she experiences the conscious sensation of hunger. Okay, and the conscious desire for food and the enjoyment of acquiring food and eating it. Similarly with sex, if a fish is willing to exert significant amounts of energy getting to a mate, I think we can all understand the kind of conscious state concomitant with such endeavour. Enough said about that. Now for some differences. Your fish's brain is much smaller and less developed than a human brain and possesses no language centres, for example. Thus, we can conclude that it doesn't have any verbal narrating self accompanying her actions. Okay, so yeah, a fish's brain is much, much smaller. Even when a fish's brain is larger, if there are any fish with larger brains than they're much less complex, they're less evolved than human brains, and therefore they're less intelligent. And yes, they have no fish quite clearly don't have language. I mean, obviously a dolphin isn't a fish, it's a mammal, and it seems to have some very basic language with its clicking, but it's much more basic than human linguistic ability. But yeah, anyway, we're talking about fish, and fish don't have any linguistic abilities. They don't have, complex language like humans. Humans have. They don't seem to have any sort of language whatsoever. They have means of communicating, but it doesn't seem to be complex language. And from that, we can conclude that as a fish makes its way, or as your fish floats around your tank, it's not thinking to itself the way you would. Like if you leave a human in a room somewhere, the human will sit down and will be in his head thinking, oh, what am I doing here? What am I going to have for dinner? And we talk to ourselves, and we use words. We narrate. We have a tendency to verbally narrate a lot of our lives. Now, a fish has no language at all, so we can conclude that it doesn't do that. It's incapable of doing that. So its life will be much more in the moment. It won't be planning for the future and things like that. It won't be chatting to itself or worrying about the past or worrying about the future. It would live much more in the moment, because it's our linguistic abilities that allow us to live so much in the past and the future as humans. So yeah, no linguistic abilities. What's next? Okay. Thus we can conclude that it doesn't have any verbal narrating self accompanying her actions. Our large brains and linguistic abilities are what set us apart most from the other animals. It is language primarily that allows us to reflect on our own conscious existence and to reflect on the past and to imagine and plan for the future. Yes, so your fish won't be in its tank thinking, oh, what is the nature of my consciousness, or what is the meaning of life? It just doesn't have the linguistic ability to do that. So it will be in its tank just and we do. There are times in your life where you will experience where that verbal self will stop. For example, if you're going for a stroll and there's nothing on your mind, you can just walk through nature, enjoying nature, looking around, looking at the trees, and enjoying the breeze or what have you. And there'll be no narrating self taking place in your mind. There'll be no word. You won't be talking to yourself at all. You'll just be experiencing your immediate conscious sensations. That's a fish's life will be like that all the time, because it can't talk to itself verbally. Okay, so that's one big difference between your fish and yourself. From this, we can conclude that your fish lives in the present moment, with its forethought and planning for the future not extending very far into the future at all. The purpose of her life will be to make the current moment as comfortable and pleasurable as possible. So, for example, she will move to the warmest, the part of the tank that where the temperature is most pleasing for her. If she sees something that she knows can bring pleasure, like food or a mate, she will pursue it. She can't reflect on the meaning of life or on the nature of consciousness, since these are linguistic abilities. Humans that are never taught any language, like feral children, for example, are similarly observed to live much more in the present moment than linguistic humans. Okay. Then, if she experiences anything like love, it is much more reduced than the human experience of love, since she lacks language and hands, etc., that allow for more intimate and intricate communications between humans that generate understanding and love. So yeah, whilst fish can communicate with each other to some extent through body language and stuff, and being near each other, and because they're similar configurations of conscious energy, their modes of communication are much more limited than human modes of communication, where we can talk to one another, produce art for one another, sing to one another. We have fingers that we can, caress one another with, etc. So we can, as I say here, These modes of communication allow for far more intimate and intricate communications between humans that generate understanding and love. So we can see love, we get a hint here of love being a something that expands with intelligence. So we are capable of being more loving to one another. We aren't always loving to one another. We're often very hateful to one another. But we're also, as humans, we're often very loving to one another. And the complexity and depth of that love is dependent on our intelligence and on all the different means of communicating with one another that we've developed, all the intricate and elaborate ways of communicating with one another that we've developed throughout evolution. And these developments set us apart from more simpler animals like fish. Okay, next, her conscious life is much less complex and varied than yours because she represents a much less evolved formation of conscious energy. The further we look back in evolutionary history, the less complex are the formations of conscious energy, and therefore the less complex are their conscious lives. Okay, so fish are much on the evolutionary scale. Fish are way behind us. Okay. This regression goes all the way back to the elementary particles of our universe, such as electrons, possessing very basic consciousness, but including some conscious perception of their local universe, as well as the conscious ability to choose from limited sets of possible future states to instantiate, since all conscious entities possess these two basic conscious abilities. For example, your fish can consciously perceive the temperature of the water locally surrounding her and consciously choose to move towards the warmth. An electron can consciously perceive a magnetic field and choose to align its spin either up or down with respect to the magnetic field. And you can consciously read my words, and then you can consciously choose to like, share, and subscribe. Okay, so let's parse that a little bit. So yeah, consciousness is not an emergent phenomenon, as it's been thought to. For the past 100 years or so, scientists have believed that consciousness is emergent. That is, they've believed that energy, the basic energy of our universe, is not intrinsically conscious, that it has no conscious experience whatsoever. And then somehow consciousness switches on. Around humans, around our brains, they think. But for 100 years, they've totally failed to explain how or why. And over those 100 years, the range of things that we believe to be conscious has just expanded and expanded. And now that range, that set of things that we believe to be conscious has expanded to include even basic energy and basic particles, even electrons are conscious entities. Now that's a bit of a shock at first. But you just need to reflect on it a little bit, because after a little bit of reflection, it's not that shocking at all, really, because you yourself are made out of nothing except for electrons, protons, and neutrons. That's scientific fact, undeniable. You are made out of energy, electrons, protons, and neutrons. Scientists have examined the human body on all scales, and they have found nothing else. Every neuron is made out of electrons, protons, and neutrons and energy. That's all any of us are made of, and we are all intrinsically conscious. And that intrinsic consciousness is throughout your entire physical form. And there are electrons, your brain is constantly under reconstruction, It's constantly taking, the food you eat, part of it goes to rebuild, to constructing your brain. So it's taking those electrons, protons, and neutrons from your food and reconfiguring them into your brain. And the most logical way for that to, and obviously your brain is conscious. The most logical way for that to happen is if all the electrons, protons, and neutrons, all energy is conscious, and it can form into different formations having different conscious experiences. Okay. Anyway, I explained that in the other lectures a lot. So yeah, consciousness is not an emergent phenomenon. All the energy is conscious, and it has different experiences depending on how it's formed. Like conventional physics has shown that you can take the basic energy and you can form it into anything. You can take the basic energy, because there's basic energy created in the Big Bang, and that energy has formed a football, it's formed a chair, and not just one, many footballs and many chairs. It's formed humans, it's formed fish, it's formed electrons, it's formed protons, etc. These are all conscious, but they have different conscious experiences depending on their configuration of the energy. And some of these forms have become exceedingly complex, and humans are the most exceedingly complex formation that we know. And that is why we are the most intelligent. That is why we have the most complex and intelligent conscious experience compared to any other animals, because we are more physically complex configurations than them. And then there's a regression. From humans, you can work your way back to more and more simple forms. And they have less intelligence and more simple conscious lives. It's very clear that whilst chimpanzees are very intelligent, they have much less complex conscious lives than humans. They can't appreciate music, they can't appreciate art, they can't talk. They don't have the wide range of feelings and emotions that we have, because they're less complex, and they can't do mathematics, they have less complex brains, they can't predict the future as well as we can, etc., etc. But this regression goes all the way back through evolution, but it doesn't stop. There's no switching on of life or switching on of consciousness. It's all been alive and it's all been conscious since the very first moment, which was the Big Bang. That was actually a physical and conscious state or event. And electrons, for example, the basic particles, the fundamental particles of our universe, are the most simple formations of conscious energy in our universe, and therefore they have exceedingly simple conscious lives. So I talk about the fish. Your fish has a more simple conscious life than yourself, but all conscious entities, so humans, fish, or electrons, any conscious entity, any individual conscious entity, they all have the same basic, two fundamental basic conscious properties or abilities. And those two conscious abilities are some conscious perception of their local universe. So like you now, wherever you are, you can perceive your room around you locally. You can't perceive the whole universe. You can only perceive the universe local to you. Consciousness is local. So an electron as well has local perception, conscious perception of its local universe. So an electron can be in free space, whizzing through free space, but then it can enter into a magnetic field, and it will have a different conscious sensation in the magnetic field than in the free space. How can we tell this? Well, because its behavior changes. So when a conscious entity's behavior changes, it's because of changes in their conscious experience. So when an electron enters the magnetic field, it always does one of two things, and that is it either aligns its spin, which is its magnetic moment, aligns its spin up with the magnetic field, that is in the same direction as the field, or in exactly the opposite direction. It always does one of those two things. Why? Because it has conscious sensation of the magnetic field, and those two ways of orienting itself with the magnetic field are the two most pleasant ways. And just like you always try and find the most pleasant way of existing, the most pleasant physical configuration or interaction with your environment that gives you the most pleasure or least discomfort. Okay, so yeah. So this regression goes all the way back to the elementary particles of our universe, such as electrons, possessing very basic consciousness. That includes some conscious perception of their local universe, as well as the conscious ability to choose from limited sets of possible future states to instantiate. So this is the other important property that all conscious entities have, which is to be able to choose from sets of possible future states. So as I said, you could like this video, or you could dislike it, or you could do neither. So there are three. There's a set of three possibilities, and you have the conscious ability, and this is called limited free will. You have the conscious ability to choose from that limited set of what you want to do. Right now, you can click thumbs up, or you can click thumbs down, or you can do neither. And all the basic particles of our universe have the same ability. Now, they can't watch YouTube videos and click like or dislike, because they're not suitably configured. They're much simpler than that, but they can do things like choose between aligning spin up or spin down with a magnetic field. And the fish can choose to will consciously perceive the temperature of the water and consciously choose where to position itself. Okay, so that's enough. Because this is just about how we apply the principles to deducing the conscious states of other entities. Now, if you'd like to hear more about the quantum mechanics, where I explain and prove that particles such as electrons, protons, and neutrons, that is quantum entities, prove that they are conscious entities, then there's a lecture on this channel called The Truth About Quantum Mechanics and Consciousness, where I give the correct interpretation of all the experiments of quantum mechanics, which have for 100 years have been very mysterious. But once we postulate that all energy and all particles are conscious, that energy is intrinsically conscious, then quantum mechanics immediately makes very clear sense. And then this also makes very clear sense of our experience as conscious entities. Why? Well, because we're made of nothing. All humans, according to science, are made of nothing except quantum entities. So it makes sense that we're conscious because all the particles we're made of are conscious. And that also makes sense of why our entire bodies are conscious, because they're made of conscious particles, or your entire body. And it explains why you have different conscious sensations in different parts of your body, because the type of conscious experience experienced within a physical form depends on the configuration. And so the configuration of particles in your fingertips is different than the physical configuration of particles in your retina, and that's why the particles in your fingertips give rise or experience within themselves sensations of touch, whereas your retinas give experience the conscious experience of light. Okay, so that's it really, and how the physics of consciousness works is by acknowledging that all energy and therefore all particles are conscious. These particles come into different forms. When they're in a different form, that changes the conscious experience. So you have an electron on its own has one type of conscious experience when it's in free space. Then it encounters a proton, it's attracted to the proton, feels some sort of physical force, like you feel the physical force of gravity. You're conscious of that force. An electron is conscious of the physical force attracting it to a proton, and then it chemically bonds to the proton to make an atom. That's a hydrogen. Is that hydrogen? That is hydrogen. Yeah, that's a hydrogen atom, a proton and an electron together. Of course, I got confused with helium for a second. No, that's the hydrogen, and then in the sun, hydrogen atoms are forced together in fusion to make helium. Okay. But the electron then, when it bonds with the proton, now it's bonded into an atom, chemically bonded into an atom, so that changes its conscious experience, okay? So just like you have if you're on your own, you have one type of conscious experience. If you're hugging your girlfriend, you're having a different, that changes you're still an individual, you're still a conscious individual, but it does change your conscious experience if you're hugging your girlfriend. I mean, your body temperature will increase, for example. You'll have conscious sensation of touch. You'll be within her gravitational field as well. Interesting scientific fact. Because all physical objects generate a gravitational field, or in other words, all massive objects warp space-time. When you're sitting next to your girlfriend, not touching, but sitting just next to one another, the gravitational force between you that you're attracting each other with is about the weight of a stamp. So there you go. That's one of those little scientific facts that I like. So the electron on its own in free space has one type of conscious experience, then it bonds into an atom, and it has another type of conscious experience when it's bonded in the atom. And similarly, the conscious experience for the proton changes. When it's got an electron orbiting around it, that changes the proton's conscious experience as well. And then through the 14 billion years of physical evolution in our universe, the basic particles are bound together into more and more complex forms. So first the generation of the particles, they're all conscious. They bond into conscious atoms, each having a different conscious experience. But, so for example, hydrogen atoms would all have very similar conscious experiences because they're similar configurations, and then helium would be a slightly different conscious experience, and then all the way up to plutonium and stuff would be different conscious experiences still. Then we get chemical evolution where the atoms bond together into molecules. This creates new conscious experiences. And because these configurations are more complex, these conscious experiences will be more complex as well. And this increasing complexity evolves and evolves and evolves until we have humans. And here's the interesting thing about humans. We're so complex that we have developed this very complex conscious ability of self-reflection. And it's very dependent on language. So we develop language, and then we develop self-consciousness. So this ability to reflect on our own existence. Most conscious entities can't do that. A dog can't do that, or a plant. A plant consciously just feels the sunlight, and moves toward heliotropism, moves towards the sun because it enjoys sunlight because that's its energy. So it will feel the sunlight, it will feel the cold, but it won't reflect on, I exist. It won't be able to reflect on that and become self-aware. A dog as well can't do that. It just, one minute it's hungry and then it's chasing food, the next minute it sees the ball and then it's chasing the ball. And it's just living in one constant present. But us humans, thanks to language and thanks to our intellectual development, we've become so complex, so intellectually complex, that we wake up to our own existence. And we're like, whoa, I'm a physico-conscious being existing in the universe on a giant round rock that's flying through space at great speed around an incomprehensibly large ball of fire. The sun is exceedingly large. It takes up 99.9% of the mass of the solar system is just the sun, which is pretty incredible. But then, of course, the sun is tiny compared to the galaxy and the black hole at the center, and there's billions of galaxies. We can wake up to these facts and experience the awe at our own existence. But yeah, the way to explain consciousness and the way to explain how we are conscious is because the energy that we are formed out of is intrinsically conscious. And the reason we can know this is definitely true, how I've proved this beyond all reasonable scientific doubt, is because it, one, gives the first logical interpretation of the experiments of quantum mechanics, check that out, and two, it's the only postulate that allows for us to construct a sensible physics of consciousness that solves the hard problem being, in its most simple form, how are we conscious if all the energy that we're formed out of isn't conscious? Well, the thing is that the question hides a lie. All the energy and particles that we are formed out of are conscious. So that's how we're conscious. Okay, so check out my other lectures if you'd like to understand that more. And yeah, in the forthcoming lectures, I'm going to show more applications of my theory. So a few more applications, a few more explanations. Check out the lecture called The Solution to the Hard Problem if you want to know all the principles and hear them stated and hear them explained and justified. Yeah, it's all very interesting because this is actually finally, after hundreds of years, the solution to the hard problem of consciousness. It's very revolutionary to understand that the universe has been conscious since the beginning of time. That's why it's taking a little bit of time for me to be noticed, and because, yeah, professional scientists don't want this to be true because it means that they're wrong. So they're kind of trying to suppress me. But anyway, so yeah, like, share, and subscribe. So please share this with anyone you know interested in consciousness. Why? Well, because it has a lot of medical implications for the development of new medical treatments, such as developing the placebo effect. My theory makes immediate sense of the placebo effect. That is, your thoughts affect the health of your body. Well, that makes sense if all your brain and all your body are intrinsically conscious and they're physically connected to each other. They're all in physico-conscious connection. So your thoughts are directly and consciously connected to your body. So my theory makes immediate sense of that and actually allows us to develop the placebo effect a lot. But I need to gain some attention so that we can start doing the experiments that prove my theory and start developing the placebo effect. Okay, so stay tuned for more applications of the principles. Go check out the principles, check out the essay on quantum mechanics, which gives the simple interpretation of quantum mechanics. And yeah, hope you enjoyed. I think the next lecture will be about energy. So this particular essay, someone responded with a query about how energy can all be, how all energy can be conscious. So that will be the next one will be called Energy and the Principles of the Physics of Consciousness. Okay, take care, all the best. Thank you.